So we just got the last episodes of Daisy Jones and the Six from Amazon Prime, and yeah, I've got some thoughts, so let's get into it. So Daisy Jones is one of the latest dramas coming from Amazon Prime. It was written by these people, directed by these people, and it stars these people. So Daisy Jones and the Six is almost like a historical fiction musical drama that covers a band going from all the way from the late 60s or even some childhoods to the early 60s all the way through the late 70s, following this band's progression through time and their rise to fame, eventual fall, and what we find out how that happens and some of the events leading up to that and even some of the events coming after that. It's set in sort of a documentary format, so we're getting an interview of the bandmates in the future. It's set 20 years in the future, sort of like they're getting interviewed in the late 90s talking about the band all the way through the late 60s and early and late 70s. So we're getting that viewpoint as well as getting present day footage as well, or not even necessarily footage, just describing the events of what's going on in the band. And we follow them through the rise and fall, through picking up Daisy Jones and what happened with this band through that period. So let's get into what I liked about the show. And first off, I'm very much a fan of this sort of musical, historical fiction approach. I just, as a musician, I really enjoy stories like these. I enjoy dramas like this, and they did a really good job of setting it up. It was musically accurate. The instruments were playing. It looked like the people knew what they were playing. The music sounded right for the era, so they definitely had people who knew what they were doing, working on the show, creating the music, instructing the actors and actresses what to do in certain situations, even how they use some of the musical nomenclature, like what chords progressions they were using, and even sort of the recording equipment was all correct. I kind of vetted all of that as someone who's worked in the music industry and done recording and things like that. So that was all correct. And so it's nice to see one take detail and appreciation for how things were done back then, making sure it's accurate, not just slapping the 60s and 70s music label, but not really making it accurate. And it's not a mockumentary like something like Spinal Tap where they're making fun of the music industry or things like that. It's a very accurate, detailed picture, but it's also a drama that's focused on the characters and it's not just a nostalgia piece. And I really appreciated that. Obviously, it's set in the late 60s going through the 70s, and you're going to have features of that in the show. That's just natural, but it's not nostalgia bait. They're not just trying to get you with the nostalgia factor and throw in all these things that make you, oh, I remember that from the 60s and I remember that from the 70s, or I wouldn't say that, people older than me would say that, right? They're not trying to grab you with that. These are really well fleshed out characters that are very compelling as you follow them through their stories and their musical journeys. They come from a variety of backgrounds. Most of the band, before they end up meeting Daisy, they're from Pittsburgh, and they have a very different background than Daisy, someone who grew up in LA. And so already these characters have different backgrounds. Even the characters who come from Pittsburgh all have different backgrounds. The Dunn brothers had, an alcoholic father who left them, and so they're dealing with that past, and some of the other bandmates, some of the things that happened in their past. Obviously, Karen is from Britain, and then Daisy and her struggles that she's had with her family and her personal life. And so we bring all these characters together, and really it is still a character-centric show. Still focused on the music and the band, their rise and fall, of course, but really it is still character-centric. They're not trying to bait you with the nostalgia. They're not trying to bait you with the music, because nostalgia bait, or the fact that it's a music influenced show, may grab you for a few episodes, but it's not going to be able to last a whole season if you don't care about these characters. But they made you care about the characters, specifically, of course, Billy Dunn and Daisy being the most compelling. But I also thought that Eddie and even Billy's brother really added some nice things to it. I do really enjoy the drummer in this one as well. He is kind of nice comedic relief, and sometimes what can feel like a heavy show is you're dealing with these really big themes with these artists trying to deal with sort of the depression of being a musician. What I also like the show is that they do some montaging, but they also show you what the real struggle is like to play in a band that's not that popular, and especially at that time. As someone who's played in bands and done gigs, I did definitely share some of the experience with them as they play these small gigs at these small venues, and they're dragging their equipment around and having to set up, and nobody cares who they are, and they're struggling, and they have no money. And I think that is showing that there's difficult parts of being a musician before they achieve this success. Some of these musicians put in decades of work of basically making no money, basically living close to homeless. I mean, there's like 6 of them at one point who all live together in a tiny house in LA, right, as they struggle to try and make it as musicians. So it's not just like a montage of them being super rich and successful and then sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? They show the struggle, the initial struggle of trying to make it as a band, trying to write songs that are compelling, you know, and take the shots that they get. There's a couple instances in the show where they bump into some famous producers or managers, and they take that opportunity and do whatever they can, say whatever they can to try and get their attention, to try and move their career forward. And I think that's really interesting. It helps you root for these characters as they move through, because you've seen them struggle. It's not that just like they start on top and they're kind of dirtbags because of what the rock and roll lifestyle has done, but you saw them struggle and work for it. So you're cheering for them to get big and to make improvements and move forward in their career, right? So you're with them every step of the way, you know, like I said, rooting for them to make it big because you've seen how much they struggle. Another thing is this is a very bingeable show, okay? They kind of leave you on cliffhangers sometimes, but you're also very interested in seeing, okay, where's the band gonna go next? And knowing how, what they show you in the first episode, where things sort of end up, you're like, well, how did they get there? What happened? How did this happen? And so it's a very bingeable experience. It was definitely tough for me to watch 3 episodes and then have to wait another week, but that's part of the fun of the new Amazon model and what Disney does, where they bring out the show in batches. And I do think that's much better than the Netflix model, because you spend more time thinking about the show and anticipating it. Another thing as well, it doesn't show music and the music industry in this very super cynical way. I think sometimes in these historical fiction music shows, or anytime the music industry is depicted, it's just depicted as everyone is a dirtbag who's preying on everyone else and is completely cutthroat, and no one's doing it for the music and they're just trying to be famous. And I think that this show kind of takes a different take on it, how they show writing music and working in a band. It can also be amazing. It also can be an amazing artistic expression that can enrich your life. And so it doesn't take an ultra cynicist route. Obviously it shows the dark sides of the music industry and some of that had happened during that time period. And that's just being historically accurate, but it's not a completely cynical take where it's just showing all the bad things and making a statement that the music industry was completely terrible. It's like, it does give people opportunities, and it does give people a different and better life. It shows how Billy and his brother would have had a terrible life back in Pittsburgh if it weren't for their success in the band, right? And so it does help people's life to some degree. But now we're gonna get into what I didn't particularly like about the show. I think about halfway-ish through the season, or about 2/3 through the season, things start to get a little unfocused. And mostly it has to do with the storyline involving Bernie, who's the disco diva of the show. And I did enjoy her as a side character earlier in the show, but we get a little too lost in the weeds with her character later in the season. And if you've read the synopsis of the book, right, she's not really that prevalent as she is in the show. So you can tell a lot of this material had been added in for the show, and you can definitely tell that it was not written or by the same people, or really the material wasn't really taken from the book, and it was sort of slapped at the end. Particularly there's an episode that almost completely focuses on her that I think could have been done well, that they tried to tie back into the main plot, but it just didn't work for me. That episode just didn't work for me. It felt like way too much of a detour. We had all this momentum with the band and Billy and what was going on, and then we just take this route, almost like Stranger Things season 2, where we try to go off to the side somewhere. And for me, this just didn't work. I don't think it really cut off the momentum of the show for me, and I was waiting for this episode to end. Although we get a little bit of what's going on in the main plot, I was waiting for this episode to end so we could finally get back to what was going on with Billy and the band. You really could have condensed that episode down to maybe 5 to 10 minutes and given us more material regarding the rest of the show. Another thing for me is I wasn't 100% satisfied with his ending. It seemed to work out a little too well for me and sort of take from previous things that we had seen. I think many people will like the ending. If you do, that's totally fine. For me, I don't know, I wasn't 100% satisfied with how this ended up. It didn't really make sense to me in terms of the show and some of the themes like that. I did really like the final episode. I thought it was done really well, and it takes a little more of a, like I said, that less cynical and more heartfelt approach with this entire journey. So I do have to appreciate that, but that's not how I personally would have ended the show. So in conclusion, this is a really good, compelling sort of musical historical fiction a drama that takes place in the 60s and 70s. So if you're into the 60s and 70s music scene and some of that culture and iconography, if you're into music similar to Fleetwood Mac or soft rock at that time, I think you're really gonna enjoy this show. If you don't particularly care about the music industry, I think you're still gonna find the story compelling. It's not just relying on that. And although this show does get a little unfocused at times, overall it was a really great watch and something that I probably would like to go back and rewatch, every so often, because it really was that enjoyable. It had a nice mix of things. I'm going to give this show a grade of an A double minus. It was pretty solid. I enjoyed it. Like I said, got a little unfocused near the end. Wasn't 100% satisfied with how the show concluded, but other than that, really solid and one of the better series I've seen so far this year. So let me know your thoughts on Daisy Jones and the Six in the comments down below. I'd really like to hear it. You should like and subscribe to the channel to see more content, and I'll see you guys next time.